This is BTV World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali and you're watching Fault Lines. The temperature of the world is rising. Climate change is hitting us very hard as a reality. That is daunting, the survival of human race on Earth. In last 650,000 years, Earth never had this level of carbon dioxide emission that we have today. In the entire history of temperatures being recorded, the last 19 years were the warmest. The sea level of the oceans is rising. And amid all of this, all the world's leaders have to offer is a rhetoric. We do not see any impact on ground as the floods are hitting the major cities. And the bushfires are playing havoc in Turkey, United States, and last year in Australia, when it burned more than 18 million hectares of land. We have taken out an explainer video with TDC, that's a YouTube channel. Watch this explainer video before I bring my first guest to the program.
This is a simple explanation of climate change based on an article in the New York Times. The average temperature on the surface of the planet has already increased 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880, which may not seem like much, but think about it this way. The heat from human emissions is roughly equal to 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs exploding across the planet every single day. Future generations are in big trouble, but for now, it'll gradually continue to get warmer and storms will grow more intense, with longer periods of drought in between. But longer term, if emissions continue to rise unchecked, the climate disasters will be so severe they will destabilize entire nations, send millions of refugees across borders, cause widespread extinction of most species on Earth, and melt the polar ice caps, leaving most of the world's coastal cities several feet underwater. All this could take centuries, but something like the sudden collapse of agriculture would trigger immediate chaos in society. Best case is we get our act together and begin to rapidly bring emission levels down. Meanwhile, Earth turns out to be less sensitive to greenhouse gases than we currently believe, plants and animals adapt quickly, and major technological breakthroughs help society limit emissions and adjust to climate change. But these are all the opposite of what we're actually seeing, so the only thing in our control is to limit emissions using all available tools and best behaviors currently at our disposal. Worst case, the collapse of food production causes spiraling prices, and as our capitalist utopia breaks down, billions starve as our world gets violent and messy real quick, kind of like a zombie apocalypse, but with extreme hunger spreading chaos instead, so yeah, still just like a zombie apocalypse. This would be coupled with the melting of the Antarctic ice sheet, leading to rapidly rising seas that would force us to abandon many of our greatest cities and all of the social and scientific progress that we were making within them. Adding insult to injury is the fact that many of the emissions were emitted while building these now abandoned underwater metropolises. If emissions continue unchecked, we're looking at a total rise of between 80 to 160 feet, which would occur if all the ice in the poles melted. So the oceans will rise. The real question is how fast?
My first guest is in the program is Osama Rizvi. He is energy analyst with a special focus on climate change. Osama, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Reading you quite often, and you are a frequent writer about the subject of climate change. How serious do you believe, Osama, is the problem?
Well, unfortunately, the recent events across the world have showed the seriousness and also the significance of this climate change, which rather would be more feasible to be called climate crisis now. So there have been more than 60 fires in Turkey. We know that there is a fear of drought in the U.S. The heavy rainfalls in China has caused damage of crops from beans to soybeans to corn. In Belgium and in Germany, there have been floods, unprecedented. And after the floods, there have been floods of garbage and waste. China received an year's rainfall in 3 days. And these are only few of the events that has happened only recently. And I mean, that is more of a real-time evidence that is enough for anyone in the world to see that climate change is very real and a very serious, grim concern for the world.
Osama, if I understand you correctly, do you want to say that the climate change and the food crisis that the world is facing with each passing year are quite interrelated?
Yes, that is actually a very good question and a very good point. I mean, there are many consequences of this climate change and climate crisis. However, one of the mm, significant ones is its relation to food prices. So when rainfalls happen, when floods happen, or when rainfall does not happen, it disturbs the global supply chain of the food. And there are hundreds of examples, even in Pakistan, that the food price inflation is at its highest in the past 11 years. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the food prices have risen the fastest in the past 10 decades. And why is this happening? This is all happening because of the climate change, because the crops are being destroyed, or because the crops are not being harvested because of the lack of rainfall. And needless to say, this dynamic turns very ugly when this lack of food and or very expensive food causes protests across the country or across a region. When this is what is happening in Iran these days.
Osama, United Nations have set some milestone, and I was reading about it. They call it Net Zero Emission Climate UN 2050. Is it one of the rosy promises that the intellectuals at United Nations make with little trickle-down effect on world? Can you tell me more about this terminology, please?
Yeah, yes, indeed. I mean, net zero in of itself, the very pledge to go net zero, which means that the carbon emissions will amount to zero in its net effect by 2050, is something that we all need, right? So as far as it is concerned in letters, it is there and it should be there. However, as you said, yes, indeed, it is more of a rosy picture because unfortunately the reality is absolutely different. Even after 2015, when this Paris Agreement was actually signed and that net zero campaign began globally, even after that, from 2015 to 2020, around $3.5 trillion of funding was provided to oil and gas companies. I mean, that is only one example that I'm giving to you.
And
Currently, there is
are these companies playing a role for the world leaders not to take interest in these commitments that we are making?
Of course, I mean, we all know, and this is not surprising, that the financial, the companies, the multinational companies, they are a big part of lobbying, political lobbying, right? And they not only in the developing countries like Pakistan or Southeast Asian countries, even in the developed part of the world, UK or the US, they carry a lot of weight, they carry a lot of power. And indeed, uh, their policies, their assets, their money, it has been an influence. It has been a hindrance towards moving towards cleaner sources of energy. There is no doubt about it.
Osama, you mentioned in the first part of your conversation about these floods that are hitting many countries very hard, unprecedented floods that have never been seen before. We saw a recent flood in China that broke all the records they had in their known history. Now, my question here is this more a question of water management and being able to stop these rivers coming flowing into the urban centers, or is it more related with the environmental pollution that is perhaps melting more ice or we are having more rain? Please tell us more about it.
So the answer is partially both. I mean, China has a very efficient dam system and water management system, and one of its most favorite dams, the Three Gorges Dam, it is supposed to withstand a lot of rainfall, a lot of extra inflow of water. But due to the fact that there has been unprecedented, unprecedented amount of rain. Even that dam has malfunctioned. Even the other dams, I was reading, there have been warnings that some of the dams may collapse. So the water management is one side, but there is only so much that you can manage. The environmental aspect, the melting glaciers, the unusual rainfalls once again. I mean, the unusual weather, so to speak, that carries a lot of weight in what is happening recently. And we are seeing this not only in China, I mean, across the globe, Europe, even in Pakistan, India, our neighbors. So this is happening. This is a global phenomenon, and mostly due to environmental damage.
Osama, as you were telling us about the commitment that have been made by United Nations, or let me say that the agenda that has been set forth by United Nations when it comes to climate, how satisfied you are with major world powers and major contributors of this global carbon emission, how satisfied you are with their performance with regards to the milestone set by United Nations?
So, to put it very briefly, there is a thing called carbon budget that the few agencies in the world, they have set a limit, that this is the limit of emissions that we can emit if we want to control the temperature of the earth at 1.5 degrees Celsius before 2050. I mean, which looks rather impossible. So let's say 2 degrees. However, from the past 5 years, we have been emitting more than 40 gigaton of carbon emissions. And if we continue at that level, it will be only for the next 11 years that we will already exhaust our carbon budget. So I mean, that is a very simple calculation to show the real progress and the promises. So indeed, if you ask me, this is not at all satisfactory.
And I believe that United States and European Union are perhaps the front and runner when it comes to the commitments of climate change, and they are perhaps pursuing all other nations to follow the suit. Is it right?
It is right, but ironically, this is very important. The U.S. and the developed world, let's just say, they have been solely responsible also for this, what is happening right now as well. Um, After colonization, during the world wars, it was a certain number of countries, not the whole world, a certain number of countries that caused this much of environmental deterioration, that the CO2 emissions reached at this point. So even now, the top 10 economies account for more than 70% of CO2 emissions, and among the top 10, the top two or three accounts for a quarter of it. So the distribution is highly skewed even now. So that's ironic.
Thank you very much, Osama, for being a part of my program. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join back with the second segment of the program. Stay with us.
Badshai Mosque, or the Royal Mosque in Lahore, commissioned by the sixth Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1671 and completed in 1673, is the second largest mosque in Pakistan and South Asia and the fifth largest mosque in the world. Epitomizing the beauty, passion and grandeur of the Mughal era. It is Lahore's most famous landmark and a major tourist attraction. Capable of accommodating 5,000 worshippers in its main prayer hall and a further 95,000 in its courtyard, it remains the largest mosque in the world. From 1673 to 1986, a period of 313 years, when overtaken in size by the completion of the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad. Today, it remains the second largest mosque in Pakistan and South Asia and the fifth largest mosque in the world after Masjid al-Haram, Grand Mosque of Mecca, and Al-Masjid al-Nabwi, Prophet's Mosque in Medina. The Hassan II Mosque in Casablanca and the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad. To appreciate its large size, the four minarets of the Badshai Mosque are 13.9 feet, 4.2 meters tall than those of the Taj Mahal, and the main platform of the Taj Mahal can fit inside the 278,784 square feet courtyard of the Badshai Mosque, which is the largest mosque courtyard in the world. Architectural wonders of Pakistan.
Welcome back. In this segment of my program, I have with me Danish Mustafa, Professor in Critical Geology from King's College London. Danish, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good to be there.
Danish, we are talking today about the climate change. And what I would like to understand is that has it really started hitting the common man? Or is it still something that is yet to affect the day-to-day life of a common man in the street?
Well, I think that you could definitely ask that question of the survivors of 1,300 people who died of the heat wave in Karachi in 2017. It has definitely started affecting. Climate change is almost like yesterday's news. And every time you're hearing about massive floods, E11 residents probably also have something to say about climate change. So I think it's definitely a reality that we have to come to terms with and actually recognize that it is a clear and present danger at the moment. It's a part of our lives now.
And do you think that the only issue that is causing this climate change is only the pollution or the problems that we are doing through the environment? Or do you also believe that the lack of urban planning is also one of the major reasons why we are having this issue affecting all of us now?
Well, I think that I think it would be simplistic to say that, well, first of all, there is incontrovertible evidence, scientific evidence, that this is human-driven climate change. So actually, in the scientific circles, there's no longer debate about it. It's caused by human activity. Along the way, then, in Pakistan, we have a very poor urban planning paradigm, whereby what we have decided to do is follow the worst possible excesses of the North American automobile-dependent urban design, where about 80 housing societies, all automobile-dependent, and urban sprawl is something that we're going for, which basically drives people towards motorized transport. Equally, we have also gotten rid of public transport. I recall as a child in Lahore, I was one of the few people, one of the people who used to take the public transport to school. And in Rawalpindi too, I used to take public transport. And that sort of an option is very, very limited today. And as a consequence, everyone has a motorbike, everyone has a car, and that definitely contributes to the kind of problems that we're seeing.
So this urbanization or the urban migration and the design of our cities and the lack of planning in these urban townships is perhaps a reason why we are having more automobiles, and because of having more automobiles, we are having the problem of climate change hitting us more hardly. Is this what are you saying?
No, I do not agree that there is no planning. In fact, unfortunately, there is planning, and it's the wrong kind of planning. The unplanned city that you have, like central Rawalpindi or inner city Lahore or inner city Peshawar or those sorts of places, they were very environmentally friendly because they were walking cities. They were compact development, multi-use kind of cities. Whereas, unfortunately, we have learned the worst possible paradigm of planning from the West, because we have neglected our own conditions and our own socioeconomic conditions to inform our urban design. Instead, what we've gone for is what we think is modern, what we think is development, and we maintain that having an automobile-dependent urban area is presumably a symbol of development. I mean, I'm right now in Mingora, and it is a disaster. I mean, there are cars everywhere. There's no way you can get to without an automobile. So I don't think it's a lack of planning. In fact, it is the wrong kind of planning. A wrong kind of planning which essentially neglects the needs of the poor and the weakest and the people who cannot ill afford to have motorized transport.
Correct. I'll call it elitist urban planning next time. So now tell me about these droughts that we have started observing in different parts of the world. These are droughts that are unprecedented. We never had them in these areas. Tell us more about it, please.
Well, see, there is a thing called meteorological drought, and then there is a thing called the agricultural drought. Now, the question is when does an meteorological drought, which basically means that you have less rain, humans have adjusted to droughts over many centuries. And as a consequence of that, we know how to negotiate them. But relatively recently, there has been a groundwater revolution in Balochistan, in Sindh, in Punjab, and so on and so forth, that has led to enormous amounts of increase in agricultural productivity. That increase in agricultural productivity, although welcome, has also increased the vulnerability to droughts, because what we have done is, and what we are doing is, in fact, drawing down the water table. As a consequence of this, particularly in Balochistan, for example, since the 1990s, the government has been giving out free tube wells and has been providing subsidy to electricity. And as a consequence of which, the buffer that used to be there of groundwater in the event of a meteorological drought, whereby you had less rains, but you still had groundwater to carry you over through the drought period. We are systematically mining that groundwater, and as a result of which the people simply have no choices when the rains fail, and that's the tragedy of it.
Danish, do you think that the government alone can take this huge task of setting things right now, when, as you said, it has started hitting perhaps everyone? What exactly do we need to do as a society to help the government to be able to combat with the challenges that we are facing at the moment?
Well, I don't know. I mean, one thing you can't do is blame it all on individuals. Individual virtue will somehow translate into a social good. It doesn't happen like that. I mean, some people, for political reasons, may believe that. But eventually, it is, after all, state policy to have roads and interchanges and automobile-friendly urban design. That is a state choice. That is not necessarily a societal choice, because no one asked the society in the first place. And who you ask are typically the more privileged, the more elite people who can actually afford to have cars. There's an entire generation that has grown up amongst the elite in Islamabad, Lahore, Karachi, and what have you, whose only understanding of the city that they live in is through the window of an air-conditioned car. Now that is a serious problem, if you will, and that cannot be fixed by individual virtue. I think what we need to do is that refocus our attention to what the needs of our society are, what the needs of the most vulnerable segments of the society are, the 90% who cannot afford to have cars, and what kind of urban design do we need to have in order to cater to their needs. If we keep trying to replicate what, to my mind, and forgive me for saying this, Islamabad is the worst possible example of a city and how it ought to be designed. This was designed by a German-trained Greek architect who knew nothing about our countries. Now, what we need to have is a urban design paradigm that is actually grounded and coming out of the experiences and history of our own society instead of someone else.
But Danish, the issues that you so pertinently pointed out are mostly relevant in context of developing countries like Pakistan, being one of many developing countries. But we see the same issues being faced by developed countries like United States, like United Kingdom, like Germany recently had floods, like China is, flooded to such a remarkable extent never seen before. So are we facing similar issues, or are these the same trigger points for having the flash floods in all these areas, or are there a different set of events responsible for the urban flooding in these areas?
Well, I wish I could tell you that Pakistan is somehow an exception or a freak of a country. It is not. Unfortunately, we are the most normal, ordinary post-colonial society who has basically relinquished our capacity to think for ourselves to what the West has to say and what the West is doing. And basically, we have started equating development to what the Western paradigm of Western lifestyle is, sadly, as have the Chinese and as have many others. And United Kingdom increasingly, having destroyed the world, the West has come to the realization, and they have destroyed the world, to be honest with you, the United States and the United Kingdom and the Western Europe and what have you. by precipitating climate change and industrial revolution and imperialism and colonialism and what have you. What we are unfortunately trying to do, not just in Pakistan, but all over the global south, is replicate the worst mistakes of the global north. Now, while they have come around to the idea that actually having automobiles and automobile-dependent kinds of cities is a bad idea, I live in London, and in London, increasingly they're trying to turn more and more streets into pedestrian-friendly streets, walkable streets. They're increasingly trying to make more and more difficult for people to drive. And whereas we are turning around and making cities more and more automobile-friendly. I mean, literally someone was saying that today the Islamabad highway is like the Great Wall of China between one side of the city to the other. Firozpur Road in Lahore is the Great Wall of China, separating communities, separating people who have no way of crossing. I mean, the street crossing is what, every 3 kilometers? How does a woman with a child, how does an elderly person negotiate 150 stairs to go up every 3 kilometers to cross onto the other side? Communities have been divided. And the unfortunate part is that instead of thinking for ourselves, we are constantly looking towards the West. We're constantly looking elsewhere instead of within ourselves.
Thank you very much, Danish Mustafa, for being on my program. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join back with the last segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. In the last segment of the program, I have with me Dr. Asif Javed. He is Associate Professor at Bahria University and an environmental scientist. Dr. Asif, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Shabbat.
You just heard the conversation with my previous guest in the program. In light of that, how serious do you believe the problem of this climate change is in the world?
Climate change is basically change in the weather patterns or temperature, humidity, you can say all the climatic parameters. Let me a little bit explain it to you. What is climate change basically? We have greenhouse effect. Due to greenhouse effect is something like it keeps our atmosphere livable. Otherwise the earth temperature would have been minus 18 degrees Celsius and life would have not been possible. This temperature is just because of the presence of greenhouse gases, so they are the life-giving blanket atmosphere composed of all these greenhouse gases. With industrial revolution, with the deforestation, what happened is the concentration of greenhouse gases increased, and obviously there is one relationship which is more powerful of any other relationship, is that we have more greenhouse gases, we have more temperature, we have increase in temperature, and we have seen the repercussions in the 21st century right now. We have more flooding, we have hurricanes, we have natural disaster have increased from time to time. So and who is the most affected? The largest burden will fall on the developing country or the nation who don't have resources to cope with the extreme events resulted from the increase in temperature, or we can say like due to global warming.
So, Dr. Asif, what I understand from this conversation is that primarily it is the emission of gases that is the real evil, or playing the major role in that. So, when we come to this specific problem, which countries are the major contributors of these emission, and what are we doing about it? What is the world doing about it to control this emission?
Yes. There are two countries like China is the big emitter, followed by the United States. If the combined emissions from these both countries are more than 40% as compared to the rest of the world.
China and United States are contributing collectively more than 40%.
More than 40% compared to the rest of the world. So they are emitting more. And we have seen the impact on developing world particularly. Like for example, if I can quote you the example of Pakistan, Pakistan has been consistently ranked as among the top 10th vulnerable country. Pakistan is vulnerable because we have a large coastline and we have a massive reserves of glaciers uphill in the Himalayas. And our more than 40% population directly depends upon the meltwater that is coming from these glaciers. So obviously, when these glaciers will melt, those 40% people on the planet Earth will face the severe water shortages.
So the water shortages, as well as you said, the coastal lines that are
due to the
what are the risks for the coastal lines? Can you explain that a bit?
I mean, with the rise of sea level, we have major city like Karachi is on the coastline. So when the sea level rise, obviously water will come on the surface, and also the sea water will intrude into the groundwater too with the rise of sea level. Why the sea level rise? Because there are two phenomena. One is land-based ice, and the second one is sea-based ice. When land-based ice melts, when it goes into the sea level rise dramatically. If the sea-based ice melt and it enters into the sea, it becomes a water. Still, ocean or sea expands a little bit, but mild increase in the sea level. And if you look at the Pakistan condition, we don't have any sea-based ice. All the ice we have is a land-based. So that's why Pakistan has been consistently ranked as a 7th or maybe its 5th vulnerable country that is likely to be affected by the effect of climate change.
Dr. Asif, while I was reading about this issue for preparing for this program, I heard a terminology, and that's called Kyoto Protocol, 1997. What was this Kyoto Protocol, and why was it significant for us?
Yes, Kyoto Protocol was very important. In 1977, the industrialized countries, they get together and they have signed the treaty that is called, in the beautiful city of Japan, Kyoto. And they signed the treaty there. That's why this is called Kyoto Protocol. And Kyoto Protocol is all about the reduction of greenhouse gases emission. But there was certain problem. US actually did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, and Australia also didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol due to different reasons. They do have solid reasons. Actually, they have set some exaggerated targets. For example, in the Kyoto Protocol, they have divided the world into two parts: developed world and undeveloped world. So they have set the targets only for the developed world, where there is a room for development for the developing world, for example. And China was at that time, and now it comes under developing world, who is like contributing more than 20%. So US feel that this is something not good, or something like not acceptable at all, because high emitter has been exempted from the mandatory reductions. So the mandatory target setting nature of that protocol actually compels the US to back out from that protocol, Kyoto Protocol. Pakistan was signatory since the beginning of that protocol.
Okay.
So that.
And I was also looking at a statement of Senator John Kerry. We call him the environment czar of United States, and he said that the lack of commitment by the government of United States in the past toward the Paris Accord is a major reason why we are quite much behind the timelines that are set by Paris Accord. Please tell us more about it.
Exactly, because if US back out from the Kyoto and later on Paris Accord, like it was signed in 2016 in Paris. So world alone without US and Australia can't do anything, because as I mentioned that they are the big polluter of the world, or emitter of the greenhouse gases alone. So you can just count the time from 1977 to 2016, and in 2016 US committed that they will sign the Paris Accord. US and China both, they agreed to sign. And when it comes to the force in 2017 2017, US again back out from the Paris Accord. Now in 2020, when Biden came, on the first day he announced that he will readmit the US into this agreement, and now in 2001 they are the part of the Paris Accord.
So we have wasted some time in
we have wasted a lot of time.
States.
We have wasted a lot of time, and that result we have seen now. You have seen the massive flooding. You have seen the poor is becoming poor day by day, and so obviously it has long repercussions on the developing world.
At least twice in your conversation, you said that the targets set in Kyoto Protocol were exaggerated in nature.
Was ambitious.
Were over ambitious in nature. So now we have this UN's target set for 2050. We call it net zero emission. Do you think is it a bit exaggerated target in nature?
It's again, I feel it's exaggerated. Net zero is very difficult to achieve, particularly in this short span of time. There are examples like carbon neutral cities in the world, particularly in the UK. UK have reduced their emissions a lot, but still I believe it's like we need to set more realistic target. That's why US back out from the Kyoto Protocol, just because of the hard nature of hard commitments by the legal bindings of the emissions reduction. Now even in Paris Accord, there is no such target, like for example, but in Paris Accord, country has to basically reduce the emissions at their own level. There is not such condition that we have to reduce this much or this much or this much, something like that. So I feel that the target sets in Paris Accord are a little bit more ambitious.
And we have perhaps as a global community not responded to the climate crisis as seriously as we have been in case of COVID-19, which is perhaps something more visible to us. Do you agree with that?
Obviously, climate change is a more serious issue, I believe personally, because it's more serious than COVID-19. Why I'm saying it's more serious than COVID-19? Because you never know what's happening around you. And people, I saw the people saying that nature is playing crazy. Actually, nature is not playing crazy. We have done this. And people know, like for example, if person living in Islamabad, person living in the hilly areas of, like in Pakistan, and he observed the massive flooding, he never know what is the reason of this flooding. And people are dying just because of drought. And we have million and million of environmental refugees, and they don't know the reason actually. The reasons is basically the ugly development of technologically advanced countries like US, UK, and Paris, and all those countries, like emissions of greenhouse gases, and we have seen the repercussion here in the developing world. And we have not developed actually. So this is like more serious.
And this environmental refugees, the terminology that you use, do you see an uptick in that, a rise in that as we are going forward?
Obviously, I mean, like you can say, our in Pakistan, I can quote you an example, day by day our land area is desertified. We have more droughts than we have ever seen before. And it's a global phenomenon. It's happening everywhere. Like in South Atlantic Ocean, there are many books have been written on that ocean that we don't have hurricane on that ocean, but we have saw the hurricane. Why we don't have a hurricane on that ocean? Because for hurricanes, the conditions required to form a hurricane is required the warm water, warm sea surface, but we have a hurricane here, so we have devastation here in the South Atlantic Ocean too. So we have seen the implications, we have seen the effects everywhere in the world, but more visible effects are on the developing world because they don't have a resources, technological advancement to cope with such situations.
And Dr. Asif, as we proceed forward with that, as more urban floods are observed, as the soil erosion problem is increasing, there is going to be a more stress on the agricultural resources that we have, which might give birth to many conflicts in the world.
Basically, the largest victim of climate change is the water. Okay. So water, the agriculture is directly linked with the water. Like for example, in Pakistan, 90% of our water is used for irrigation. And if I can compare it with the global, 70% water is used for the irrigation purposes. So if you have less water in your reservoirs, if you have less water in your streams, so obviously your agriculture, there will be huge effect on agriculture. And when there is a huge effect on agriculture, poverty will increase, obviously. Because we have less food, prices will go high, and obviously we will see a lot of environmental refugees whose livelihood are totally dependent on the agriculture crops.
Doctor, whatever world is doing about it, now we are today living in the day and hour when we have United States making ironclad commitments to the global community, where we have European Union as the flag bearer of the environmental issue in the world. I don't know much about China, perhaps you can tell me about it. So, and there are urban centers of European Union, UK, and China under the floods. We just had a flood recently here in Islamabad, right in the heartland of our capital. So with all this together, are we improving in this synergy? Are we improving in the coordination between the nations? Or are we still developing a mechanism to improve the cooperation of states with each other?
I mean, I can see the improvement. Why? Because with the joining of new President of the United States and John Kerry especially, they are like more committed. So what happened in the past, basically, US was back out. See, so once US is like, for example, commitment of the US plays a very important role. Like for example, the decision taken in the US has a repercussion on a person living in the Swat of Pakistan area and person living in the Beijing or person living in London or so, because they are the emitter again. So I can see the hope, good sign of, like for example, intercooperation. Although in the US, I personally observe they are also doing some sort of volunteer reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. In New York, like say, I can quote you the example of New York, where I have seen lot of hybrid buses and trains are on electric systems. So they are doing a lot of work in their own country, and if they are doing some work, climate related work in their country, obviously it will affect the entire world. Same is the case with the China. Basically what happened, Shabahat, there I can tell you one equation, simple equation: old technology plus old habits, we have predictable consequences. But when new technology came, we have to change our habits, we have to change our lifestyle, because if we don't change our lifestyle and if we can go forward with our old habits with the new technology, the consequences are far beyond our expectation, and that's what is happening right now in the world. We have massive floods, we have massive devastation, we have seen all over the world.
And Dr. Saab, like in case of Pakistan, the Prime Minister has given a commitment, and the government is pursuing a huge project called Billion Tree Tsunami, and they are going to plant more trees. So for a small agricultural country like Pakistan, where we have the problem of stress on our water resources, if we happen to accomplish this target of having 1 billion, or even say 50% of it, will it have a positive impact on our environment?
That's a very interesting question which I would love to answer, because Billion Tree Tsunami has a lot of significance. But before going to answer this question specific, the policies varies from country to country and from region to region. For example, if you look at the Pakistan emissions of greenhouse gases is less than 1% compared to the rest of the world. So if Pakistan become 100% carbon neutral country, even then you can imagine how much impact will be generated in the rest of the world. But on the other hand, the significance of climate change phenomena is very important for Pakistan, because Pakistan is mostly affected, is likely to be most affected country.
As you said, in the top 5 or top 6.
Top 5 or top 6. Okay. So the Billion Tree Tsunami project is very important in terms of the conservation of water resources. Like if we have more trees, we have a more evapotranspiration, and we have a more rainfall, then what happens? We have a more water underground. So obviously, in keeping in view the water stress condition of the country and ongoing emissions of carbon dioxide, or climate change rather I would say, so the Billion Tree Tsunami is a very important project for Pakistan, and to improve the water condition of Pakistan especially. The added advantage are, they are the carbon sinks. Obviously we have less carbon dioxide because trees are the carbon sinks. So these are the added advantage for the rest of the world. But for Pakistan specifically, in terms of water, the Billion Tree Tsunami project has a lot of significance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asif, for being in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, environment problem, the climate issue is there. It is the elephant in the room. Looking away or shying away from this evil will just increase the problem for all of us. It is the question of survival of the human race. It is the question of survival for upcoming generations. We cannot afford to look away as individuals, as societies, as country, and as human race. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.